Right now, you're probably drunk, or about to get drunk. And the last time you had a drink, whether it was a cold beer after work, a glass of wine with dinner, or a cocktail at a bar, you probably just drank it, put the glass down, and forgot about it. But what you did in that moment is actually one of the oldest, most deeply human things you can do. It is older than writing, older than farming, and frankly, it actually predates human beings entirely. Our relationship with alcohol didn't start a few thousand years ago when we built the first vineyards or established the first breweries. It started about 10 million years ago on a hot, damp forest floor in Africa with a tiny primate picking up a piece of fruit that had been sitting on the ground for just a little too long. Back in 2014, a biologist at UC Berkeley named Robert Dudley published a book called The Drunken Monkey. His argument was brilliantly simple. When fruit falls from a tree and sits on the forest floor, the natural sugars inside it start breaking down. Yeast gets in, fermentation begins, and that sweet fruit starts producing small amounts of ethanol. When our primate ancestors ate that fermenting fruit, the ethanol inside it made them feel a little drunk. They had absolutely no idea why, but it felt good, so they kept coming back for more. Over millions of years, our ancestors didn't just tolerate alcohol, we actually evolved to seek it out. By the time anatomically modern humans actually showed up, the taste for alcohol was already hardwired into our biology. It was there long before anyone figured out how to make it on purpose. But that raises a massive question. When did we transition from just finding alcohol to actually making it? For a long time, the textbook story of humanity went like this. Humans settled down, started farming, built permanent villages, and then eventually discovered fermentation and started making drinks. In that old version of history, alcohol came after civilization. But in 2018, archaeologists excavating a cave near Haifa, Israel, discovered something that flipped that entire narrative on its head. The cave is called Reykjavik, and about 13,000 years ago, it was used by a group of nomadic people called the Natufians. Inside, scientists found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock. When they analyzed the microscopic chemical residue left inside those ancient mortars, they found traces of wheat and barley that had been soaked, germinated, and left to ferment. That is beer, brewed inside a cave, 13,000 years ago. Now, here is what makes that finding absolutely mind-blowing. The Natufians were not farmers. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. They were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, wandering the landscape, collecting wild grain by hand, and hunting animals for meat. They didn't grow the barley, they just found it wild. Yet, somehow, making beer was important enough to them that they figured out how to brew it before they ever figured out how to farm. Reykjavik Cave proves that these people were brewing while they were still entirely nomadic. And they aren't the only ones. About 1,000 years after the Natufians were brewing in Israel, someone in southeastern Turkey built something absolutely massive. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. There, hunter-gatherers arranged massive stone pillars, some of them weighing over 10 tons, in careful, precise circles, carving them with beautiful, intricate images of wild animals. The whole structure was incredibly deliberate and complex, but here's the catch: it was built before farming, before pottery, and before anyone in the entire region had a permanent home. For decades, archaeologists were completely baffled. Why would nomadic hunter-gatherers organize the massive, back-breaking labor needed to drag 10-ton stones up a steep hill and carve them with such precision? What could possibly motivate that kind of monumental collective effort? Well, they found large stone vats at the site. When they tested the chemical residues inside them, they found traces of fermented grain. People were brewing beer at Göbekli Tepe. And we're not talking about small, personal batches. We're talking about massive amounts, enough to feed and water huge crowds. The current theory is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't a city or a home, it was a giant gathering place for ritual, feasting, and community building. People traveled from all across the region to come together, feast, and drink. This brings us to a massive debate that has been raging among historians and scientists for decades. Why did humans actually start farming in the first place? An archaeobotanist named Patrick McGovern, the world's leading expert on ancient alcohol, has spent decades arguing a radical thesis. Humans didn't start farming to make bread, they started farming to make beer. And honestly, I couldn't agree more. Think about the logistics. Bread requires a complex, multi-step process of grinding grain into flour, kneading it, and baking it in an oven. Beer, on the other hand, is much simpler. You just soak grain in water, leave it alone, and fermentation happens entirely by itself. Plus, if you're a prehistoric human, the desire to get drunk would have been a far stronger motivator to undergo the tedious, back-breaking work of early agriculture than the desire to eat wild grains in a slightly different form. If McGovern is right, alcohol isn't just a byproduct of civilization, it might be the very reason we settled down to build it in the first place. By 7000 CE, the archaeological evidence gets incredibly precise. In a Neolithic village called Jiahu in central China, archaeologists discovered ancient pottery jars. When they ran chemical analyses on the residue inside, they found a fermented drink made from a complex blend of rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. This is officially the oldest confirmed deliberate recipe for alcohol anywhere in the world. And what's wild is that it wasn't some crude, accidental juice, it was a sophisticated, multi-ingredient blend, carefully chosen and combined. Whoever brewed this 9,000 years ago knew exactly what they were doing. From there, our love affair with alcohol only grew. By the time ancient Egypt rose to power, beer was no longer just a fun luxury, it was woven into the absolute fabric of daily life. The workers who built the Great Pyramids of Giza weren't paid in gold or coins, they were paid in beer, about 4 to 5 liters of it every single day. That was their actual salary. And historically, that made perfect sense. The water from the Nile River was often contaminated and incredibly unsafe to drink raw. But because the brewing process requires boiling, beer was sterile, it kept people alive in a way that raw water simply couldn't. Let's be honest, if you were working in the baking desert heat, dragging massive limestone blocks, and someone gave you the choice between a bag of useless metal coins or 5 liters of cold, refreshing beer, what are you picking? Yeah, same. On top of that, the brewing process added crucial calories and nutrients to their diets. For a laborer doing intense physical work, those extra liquid calories were a lifesaver. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was literally lunch. And it didn't stop at the dinner table. The Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift created by the god Osiris. It was heavily featured in temple offerings, burial rituals, and even medical prescriptions. Egyptian doctors would mix various healing herbs directly into beer and prescribe it for everything from stomachaches to severe infections. Think about that, a single drink in ancient Egypt was simultaneously doing the job of a paycheck, a sterile water filter, a nutritious meal, a medicine, and a prayer, all poured from the very same cup. So, if we stand back and look at the full picture, the timeline is clear. 10 million years ago, your primate ancestors were drawn to fermented fruit on the forest floor because it helped them survive. 13,000 years ago, nomadic humans were deliberately brewing beer in bedrock caves before they even knew how to plant a single seed. 12,000 years ago, they were dragging 10-ton stones up hills to build the world's first monuments, likely just to have a place to drink together. 9,000 years ago, they were crafting complex, multi-ingredient recipes. And 5,000 years ago, the first great empires of the world were running entirely on it. Alcohol didn't come after we built the world we live in. There is a very real, scientifically backed possibility that it is the reason we built it at all. Every single time you raise a glass to have a drink, you are continuing a beautiful, unbroken chain that started long before our species even had a name for itself. The brewing processes have changed, the ingredients have improved, and the cups have definitely gotten fancier. But the core impulse is exactly the same one that made a tiny primate reach for that overripe, sweet fruit on a forest floor 10 million years ago. We just finally learned how to make it on purpose.